So good afternoon, everyone. Can you see and hear me? Can you see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, great.
Yes.
So my name is Alda Pearson. I'm an extension specialist within the School of Veterinary Medicine and UCNR. And so for the first session today, I'll give an overview of some of the risks associated with biological style amendments in animal origin and when used in fresh produce production. And I will share some of the work we have done, a survey a few years ago. And starting just since it's an overview of biological style amendments, I will start with some definition. Sometimes there's some confusion with these different types of soil amendments. And as mentioned by Dr. DiCaprio, soil amendment is any chemical, biological, physical materials that are added to the soil to improve the soil, fertility, health, and support plant growth. They can be chemical fertilizers or animal-based soil amendments as raw manure, compost with animal manure, green waste, and cover crops as well. We are focused here specific on biological soil amendments of animal origin, and it's consistent part or a whole of materials that have origin in animals as manure or other products, non-fecal animal byproducts that we call here non-manure BSAAOs as bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, and then we'll manure-based biological soil amendments. We will have a section the next Wednesday will be about manly compost, but just definition. So it's a product, a result of controlled biological decomposition of organic matter. So that manure will be under a scientific validated process that consists normally time and temperatures, generation of heat to stabilize and reduce the microbial stats of that manure. And there is a specific process, and I'm sure Donna will mention in the next presentation. Also, we have a second series of these webinars will be about compost. And then we have another treat manure or other BSAAOs that could be another besides composting that can be a mix of chemical and physical process. And in these categories, also the no-manure BSAAOs, they go through a process that will reduce those microbial content of those materials, and we'll have on the third series of these webinars, we'll focus on these no-manure BSAAOs as well. And there's some confusion about biological soil amendments and special composting products and untreated animal manure. And treated biological soil amendments of animal origin includes raw manure, so didn't go any manure, age or stack manure. So we found in our survey some confusion between age, stack manure, and compost itself. Any untreated manure slurries that includes dairy, swine, lagoons, and compost teas that were made with untreated manure. So any soil amendment that we had with untreated manure is considered untreated BSAAOs. And sometimes we here is some examples of these piles of manure. So they just live for, this is on the middle, a pile that was left for 2 years. And since the owner didn't keep a record of the temperature and turns, it's basically static or a pile manure that was left for 2 years is considered by definition untreated BSAAOs. The biological soil amendments of animal origin are especially important for certified organic producers, as they cannot use chemical fertilizers, and as mentioned before, contribute for soil fertility, health, yield, and soil quality. And although use of manure may have, one is not properly treated, may have some risks. Livestock, they carry foodborne pathogens in their fecal material. And here just a list, some of the bacteria common we see is E. coli on 5.7, another Shiga toxin producing E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Listeria, and some parasites as well, Cryptosporidium giardia. Virus normally we see associated with manure are more related to human origin than animal. That's a concern of food safety. What you see is different species of animals. They are reservoirs and they can carry different. So, for example, in poultry, we know they typical reservoirs for Salmonella and Campylobacter, while cattle, specific cattle, they are reservoirs for E. coli on 5.7. So different sources of manure, they can carry different risks. As we know, some of these pathogens, they are in GI of some of these species, even if those animals are healthy. And some of the questions we have when we start working in this area, we did a survey that were interested, what are the practices in terms of organic farmers, what kind of biological soil amendments of animal origin are the organic farmers using? And do we need to do more research in this area or not, as these biological soil amendments are so important for organic farmers? So in 2016-17, we did a survey. It was a multi-state survey that includes several regions. We didn't have a good representation of farmers, growers in the Southeast, but we did a multi-state or multi-regional survey. And we're interested to know what are the practices in terms of biological soil amendments and what were the knowledge and the risk perceptions of farmers. And in this survey, this was mostly online survey, although we have some hard copies as well for some farmers in Midwest. So, and here's just, we asked how important was using biological soil amendments containing animal manure. And most of the response is because it's very important for soil health, nutrient management, soil tilt cost, and also handle their animal waste management. That's by depending of the region, if it's dairy or swine and so on. So we know that's very important for the growers. These are the reasons why they are interested to use biological soil amendments contain animal manure. And then we ask what type of biological soil amendments, and this is paper I can provide later on. It's kind of very rich in terms of data, but I'll just kind of highlight some of the findings. And so we ask by type of raw manuring sources, if it contains animal manure or animal products, green waste and compost, and then other types of biological soil amendments besides the manure. And there is a variation between 47 to 92% of the growers that participate in the survey, they report they use soil amendments of contain animal manure. Some of those are used of crops that are consumed fresh, 60%, and 50% of those BSAAOs were in cook and heat process. And what the real interest was all about untreated or raw manure. So for those biological soil amendments contain animal manure that didn't go any validate process to reduce microbial content of those composting, for example. And actually, there is a typo here. So 58% of, let's move this. Okay, so I can see my table. So 58% report they use raw manure, and 48% report they use compost. Here on second should be compost. And what we saw, there was a difference between regions. And I was just calling your attention here on, down here on the table, use of raw manure. We saw that West Coast, and I have to say that was mostly represented by California. They were less likely to use raw manure, reported raw manure compared with Midwest. So mostly of the West Coast, they use compost products. So what we saw was a regional difference, how the growers that participate in this survey, they're using raw manure versus compost. As well, we found different, here we go. As well, found difference about the type of treatment status vary by crop. So here on this table, looking at the top of the table regarding fresh produce, only 24% of the participant farmers reported that they use untreated manure in fresh produce crops. And while most of for fresh produce, more than 60%, they will use compost or heat-treat biological soil amendment. So there is a variation by region. There was a variation by the treatment stats and crop, and as well, and between the region. Regarding the sources of animal manure, we saw that the three main sources were poultry, cattle, and horses. We didn't have, we couldn't see different. We know there's a regional difference as well, depending if you are in the more, what is the commodities, higher commodities of dairy or poultry, although we couldn't see much that difference in this data. And as well, there was a wide variation of type of storage, how that manure was stored on the farm. Mostly was pile. Application frequency was most of the spring and fall, but there was some variation between region and how there was that manure or biological soil amendments was applied. On this survey, we asked not just about raw manure, also asked about compost, and we saw the same trend, variations by region, variations by the source of compost was very identical to biological soil amendments in general, but there was regional variations regarding the types of crops, manure source, and the practice that we observed in this survey. So the direct and part of this conversations, we know that direct and indirect of use of untreated manure increase the potential exposure to foodborne pathogens and can be a hazard. So what we know is today, what you use when you use untreated manure, the prevention of microbial contamination of the crops has been by application interval criteria between the application of that animal of manure and the harvest of the crop. And Donna will talk more about regulation. And there is different application intervals depending if you're following the National Organic Program. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule as today is not opposed to the National Organic Program or 19-120 days rule. And then they have the leafy green marketing agreement. There'll be a different criteria and some other commodity specific best practice. So as you know, and I have spent some of my work in last years, is try to understand are these criteria time interval actually enough to decrease the risk. So because the current standards, they were based on production cycle and not based on microbial food safety risk for those time intervals. So what we know is today is there's different factors that are affecting survival of foodborne pathogens, either on survival on manure or the source itself, on the soil and produce. So I already mentioned that the survival or the prevalence of some of these Salmonella, E. coli, and 5.7 on the manure itself, it depends, there's several factors. It depends on pathogen itself, depends of the species, if it's a ruminant, if it's swine, poultry, and so on, the production system, as well as husbandry practice. So in terms of the animal, we know that certain husbandry practice as stock density, they might, and diet, they might change or increase the likelihood for some of these pathogens higher shed in their fecal material. Also, we know that some species, for example, Salmonella or E. coli 157 in ruminants, higher shedding during the summer, so there's some seasonal variation on the shedding of all these pathogens. And how is the storage, the bedding? What kind of feedstocks are in the bedding? Is straw, is wood shavings, and so on. So once we apply that biological soil amendments, manure specifically in the soil, we know that also the composition of the manure itself and the soil, the application of the manure, the soil characteristics, the previous use, all those factors might change the probability those foodborne pathogens survive in the soil, as well some of the agricultural practice stealing, the source of agricultural water, and then the soil characteristics and environmental conditions. So there is a variation, and I like this graph or this scheme from a paper review paper, kind of put a different areas what my contribution for survival foodborne pathogens. There's specific soil characteristics, specific of the land use and agronomic practice, and a source of irrigation water, agricultural water. We have a series all about agricultural water in May. Also can contribute for survival or a source of these foodborne pathogens. And then the source, the manure, and the treatment and the chemical composition. So all this interaction is kind of a very complex environment that might contribute for the survival multiplication of these foodborne pathogens. So what we can do, so based how we address the risk reduction of potential contamination of these foodborne pathogens in biological cell amendments, and it's based on good agricultural practice, source of the manure, the treatment. So we spent some time today and next about the treatment and reduction of pathogens. So we know that untreated or raw manure, they are at higher risk if they have not treated to reduce those pathogens or microbial content in the manure. And then we use the time interval between application and harvest as the standards of NEOP. If you are using, the crop type is also, and the factor is that crop in touch with the soil. So we might prioritize different crop types, crops when we are apply untreated manure. I know Donna will talk a little bit more about handling and record keeping. So basically, how to reduce the risk. One way is applying the time interval between application and harvest, and depending on the different commodities and organizations, we might have different time intervals. So if we certify organic, they will follow the NEOP and 90 days and 120 days between application of that untreated manure and harvest for consumption, human consumption. So if the vegetables are not in contact with soil, it will be 90 days, and if it's contact, 120 days. LGMA, so it's a much larger 1 year between untreated manure. Another way will be treat that biological cell amendments. So there is a higher risk, as I mentioned, if apply manure that's just in the pile or aged manure. There's some studies about minimal managed piles of manure, and we know there's certain reduction of the pathogens presence of those aged manure, but how old should be that aged manure? There is not much scientific or validated data on that, and with lower risk with compost. So with that kind of, that's my presentation, the different ways of reduction, and we'll talk more about the aspect of regulatory aspect of NEOP and product safety rule, and then we'll have also a series on compost next week. We'll talk more about the different risks of age manure versus compost and so on. And that's my talk for today. I just want to acknowledge some of the funding agencies and my colleagues. Some of this work was done in my lab, and we have some time for questions at the end. Thank you.